Okay, so today we talked about 5.1 congruence in triangles. So our goal is to identify congruent triangles and corresponding parts. Congruent figures, these are figures that have the same size and the same shape. Okay, figures are congruent if all pairs of corresponding sides are congruent and all pairs of corresponding angles are congruent. Okay, so the sides are going to keep, if the sides are congruent, that's going to make it be the same size. If the angles are congruent, that's going to help it keep the same shape. Okay, corresponding parts, these are parts of a figure that match up. Okay, and what I mean by that is, like, if I have two figures, when I compare them, that would mean like the smallest angle corresponds to the smallest angle. So the smallest angle in the first figure corresponds to the smallest angle in the second figure. So I want to think like the small with the small, or like the big with the big, meaning like the longest side in one figure should correspond to the longest side in another figure. So picking out the corresponding parts on this diagram right here, I look at the congruence markings. So like angle A has one arc, it's congruent to angle D. So I'm going to say angle A is congruent to angle D, they're corresponding angles. Angle B has two arcs, it's going to match up with this angle right here, which has two arcs. So angle B is congruent to angle E. Angle C has three arcs on it, it's congruent to this angle over here, so I'm going to say it's congruent to angle F. Okay, if I name the sides, AB is a segment, and it should be congruent to, now AB, this segment has one arc, or one marking, so it's congruent to this segment over here, which is DE, because they have the same number of markings. BC has two, so it should be congruent to EF. The last one, AC, has three arcs, it is congruent to DF. Okay, if I look at these figures down here, I would say these two triangles are congruent because the 6 matches up with a 6, the 8 with an 8, the 10 with a 10, and so on. If I look here, these are both triangles, but they're not the same type of triangle, and the side measures aren't the same. Like this is 6 and 8, or 10 and 8, so not congruent. This one's not congruent, it's not the same shape. Right here it says, given that triangle STU is congruent to triangle WXZ, list all of the corresponding congruent parts. So we're going to list the angles like we did above. So angle U would be congruent to angle Z because they are marked the same. Angle T would be congruent to angle X. They are marked the same. Angle S is marked as 90, and it would be congruent to angle Y. Going to list the segments as well. So like UT has three markings here. It's congruent to ZX in the other figure. TS has one marking. It would be congruent to, right here, XY. And then the last one, US, would be congruent to our figure ZY, or our segment ZY. Okay, now the neat thing about this statement right here, it is called a congruent statement. And a congruent statement has to have the correct order, meaning like angle P comes first and it is congruent to angle E. So angle P is congruent to angle E. N comes second, it would be congruent to angle D. Angle, oops, I lied, angle M, sorry about that. Okay, angle N is the last one, it is congruent to angle C. Okay. We can check it with what we did above. Like we said, U was congruent to Z. Do you notice how U is the last one and Z is the last one? So they're in the correct order. Okay, I can also pick out the sides. So like PM would be the first and second. It would have to be congruent to ED. MN is the second and the third, right here and here. It would have to be congruent to DC. And then the last one, I could go PN, the first and the last, is congruent to EC. So I can pick out all three pairs of corresponding sides and all three pairs of corresponding angles just by looking at this statement right here. Okay. The next one says the two triangles at the right are congruent. Identify all the corresponding parts. So this is one you could practice on your own if you want to pause the video. but I'm going to go right ahead. So angle T is congruent to angle Y. They're marked the same. Angle U is congruent to angle Z. And then angle S is congruent to angle X. The sides, I could go TS is congruent to YX. I could go US is congruent to, US has 3 arcs, it would be congruent to ZX. And then my last one, UT, would be congruent to YZ. Okay, write a congruent statement. So if I name that first triangle, it doesn't matter how you name it, but TUS. The first one, the order doesn't matter. But in the second one, it has to follow this. Okay, so like angle T was congruent to angle Y. Since I started with angle T, I'm going to go Y here. U in my first triangle is congruent to angle Z in the second triangle, so this has to be a Z. S has that 3 arcs, it's congruent to the X, so that's my naming. Now, if I change the first one, the second one will change as well. Okay, more practice on the back. In the figure, it says triangle STU is congruent to triangle WXY, and they ask us to find the length of WX. Now, if I go to the statement, WX corresponds to ST. If I look at this diagram right here, WX does not have a measure, but I know it's the same as ST, and ST measures 8, so that means WX has to equal 8. Okay, finding the measure of angle S. Well, the measure of angle S, I don't know it. There's no angles listed here. But going back to that statement, S is congruent to W, and if I look at angle W, still nothing there. Okay, so I need to find that angle right there. I know there are 180 degrees in the triangle. If I subtract the 60 and the 40, I am left with 80 degrees for angle W. And if angle W is 80, that means angle S also has to be 80 because they correspond to each other. Okay, the next one says find the length of DF. Well, if I look at the naming, DF corresponds to AC. Okay, so DF is right here. I'm trying to find that. AC has a measure of 3, so DF is 3. Okay, next one says measure of angle B. And the measure of angle B is the middle one. It should be congruent to E. So if I look at angle E, it's 40. Angle B has to be 40. The next one says use the triangle shown to write a congruent statement. Like I said earlier, it doesn't matter how I name the first one, so I'm going to call it triangle JVL, and then I need to name the second one according to the first one. So J corresponds to P, so P has to go first. V has 2 arcs, it's congruent to E, and then C would go at the end. Next one says determine if the triangles are congruent. If they are, write a congruent statement. What I want to do is I want to compare 6 parts. So 3 pairs of angles and 3 pairs of sides. Okay, I see that these 2 angles are congruent, these 2 angles are congruent, and these 2 angles are congruent. So all sets of angles are congruent. For the sides, AB is congruent to AD, BC is marked congruent to DC, and then this side is shared, so it has to be the same in both triangles. So I would say, yes, they're congruent. My congruent statement, I could say like triangle ABC is congruent to triangle. Now, ABC would be congruent to triangle ADC. Order is important. Name the property that tells you AC is congruent to itself. This was back in chapter 2, I believe. This is called the reflexive property, and we are going to use it multiple times throughout this next chapter. Okay, last 2 example problems. It says in the figure, segment AB is congruent to segment AD. Determine whether the triangles are congruent, and if so, write a congruent statement. Now, if I look at just this triangle to get started, what I see is that these 2 sides are congruent. What that means is that it's isosceles, and if it's isosceles, I go to the angles opposite of it, and these would have to be congruent as well. So going over to my figure, this side is across from the 35. That means across from this side, I should also have 35 degrees. I know a triangle is going to measure 180 degrees, and in this triangle right here, I have 90. I also have 35. So if I subtract those, what I'm left with is 55 degrees. So this angle up here is 55 degrees. Now, in my other triangle, I also have 90 and 35. That means 55 degrees would be left over for this top angle as well. Okay, so when I compare the angles, these are congruent, these are congruent, these are congruent. So all the angles are congruent. Okay, the corresponding sides, AB is congruent to AD, BC is congruent to DC, AC is congruent to itself. So we've marked all 6 pieces, so we say the triangles are congruent. I could say like triangle ABC is congruent to triangle. If I went ABC, my other triangle should be ADC. going in the same order. Okay, the last one says segment XY is parallel to WZ. Determine whether the two triangles are congruent. If they are, write a congruent statement. Okay, so when I look here, I see that these two sides are congruent because they have those lines. These two sides right here are congruent. These two sides are congruent, so the sides are done. Okay, I also need to check the angles. So let's check the angles. Well, I know this angle right here would be congruent to this angle right here because they are vertical angles. Vertical angles are congruent. Okay. They also told us that this line here is parallel to this line here. So if I chose this as my transversal, I would be able to mark angle X congruent to angle Z because alternate interior angles are congruent if the lines are parallel. Okay, now I can also say these are my parallel lines and this is my transversal, which would make angle Y congruent to angle W. So now I have all 6 pieces, so I can say like triangle XVY is congruent to triangle. Now X we have marked congruent to Z. Angle V here would be congruent to angle V in the other triangle. And then the last one, angle Y, would be congruent to angle W.